Ladies and gentlemen, we are live, as this is the main event you've all been waiting for. Brought to you by Exonius, the cybersecurity asset management company. It's time!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Coffee with Ashish. I could not have asked for a better intro from the man himself, but here we are. And today's topic is going to be interesting from a perspective of if you are someone who's always asking a question, what kind of cloud security tools are there, and whether you should be looking at a CSPM, CWPP, CNAPP. I can just keep making up abbreviations as I go with C's, but C seems to be the common, maybe C for cloud. But to make that simplified for us, I have a guest here, and let me just cue in the music for the gentleman. Hey, how's it going, Patrick?
Hello, Ashish. Very, very well. How are you, my friend?
Good to have you here. And I've got a few people coming in already. Hey, morning, Vineet. Dude, you need to tell me this first. Actually, before we get into this, cheers.
Cheers.
Well, you're the Canada. Well, I need to tell about what's the story behind the cup?
Well, it's just representing. I'm we'll get into it, but I'm the lone Canadian where I work, so I feel like I have to represent that everywhere I go.
Yep, including the bag in the background as well.
That's right.
So it's like
you got
these hidden gems everywhere. So it's representing Canada. That's awesome.
That's right.
But I'm gonna start with something which is probably a lot of people may not be aware of some of your history before your current job. So I'm keen to know if you can share what was Patrick's involvement with CSPM space in the cloud security space? If you can elaborate a bit more about your professional background.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'd love to. I've been about, I think this is year 27 in IT. That's responsible for a lot of the gray for sure. I think that's all IT gray, if not security gray. I made the move to work exclusively for startups in 2008. Like I got my taste of a first one and I loved it. I have no intention of ever sort of looking back. And I think from a cloud security perspective, the most relevant of those was likely Dome 9, which I guess I was an early employee there in 2014. And if you're sort of familiar with the CSPM space, you know that it was really three companies that defined it. It was us at Dome 9. It was a company called Evident.io. And a little bit later, it was a company called Redlock. And all of these companies went on to be bought by kind of larger security companies trying to build out their cloud security portfolio. Obviously, we knew we were doing something right when that happened. But that's sort of my, I'm very fortunate that I was lucky to be there at the birth of sort of CSPM, and maybe even luckier that what I'm doing now builds on that experience so directly, for sure.
Wow. Okay. So I'm definitely going to dive into the CSPM space, but maybe this is a question that I ask a lot of people who come on our show as well. It'll be really interesting to get your perspective. So after doing CSPM from the vendor side, what does cloud security mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about cloud security as the added bucket of things you need on top of what we did in the data center, right? You need some of the same things, but I think we often make this poor assumption that we can drag these tool sets over, and there's a bit of an illusion at the start of our sort of cloud journey, because they do work at the start, right? Because we're doing the same thing we did at the data center. We're building VMs, we're building containers, we're doing something a little bit different. We're spinning up, like a storage bucket, which is a little bit different than what you do in the data center and behind the firewall. But for me, cloud security is all the different assumptions, the different tool sets. It started for me as, okay, we've got this additional plane of concern, and that is the cloud provider themselves, right? I can go and spin up workloads really with zero delay, which is very different than you and I spoke of this when we thought about what we'd speak about, right? Procurement used to have this kind of delay in infrastructure, this necessary delay that meant really no matter how fast we moved, it really didn't matter, right? It was kind of this necessary bit of time we had to take. All that's, of course, gone. Credit cards replace that big procurement window, and we can spin up absolutely anything. And not only those old things we're used to, but databases as a service. We can long-term store data. We can host our DNS in a cloud. I mean, as well as I do, the list goes on. Everything you could do with the data center, you can absolutely do on any of the big three public cloud providers, and we do now, right? So it takes because things are so fast, things are ephemeral. They spin up, they occupy IP address space, they spin down. The assumptions the tools made in the data center don't really work that well. They can, like I say, if you operate things by hand and you're kind of mimicking what you did in the data center, they can have the illusion of working. But then as you begin to really, let's be honest, we didn't drive to the public cloud at the rate we did to spin up VMs and containers, right? We at least the promise, and I'm going to challenge this a little bit if we get into it, is that we were going to leave the tech stack to those that did it the best and focus on our business, right? And that was the promise of the public cloud. I'm not sure we're there yet. Kubernetes is maybe good evidence we're not, but we'll talk about that.
Oh yeah, we did a whole month on Kubernetes security. So yeah, I can totally say that it's not perfect yet. But maybe let's get into the crux of this then. So CSPM, CWPP, CNAPP, CASB, what else is out there, and what are these, like, for people who have no idea?
Yeah, the 4 Cs. Well, first, high level, they're all Gartner categories of tools. And we've largely adopted these because they make a lot of sense. That even the traditional tools that we use kind of fall into these categories, right or wrong, they do. But one of these isn't quite the same as the other. So let's take CASB out for a second. CASB is unique in that that's a cloud access security broker, right? And the broker is the key word. It sits between the user and the cloud services they consume, right? And users typically log into the CASB or are logged into it directly with their organizational SSO. And then it enforces policies. It does many things, but it enforces those organizational policies as that user goes out and uses the SaaS services, right? Including, how much data they can kind of bring outside the organization, what that looks like, basically extend the organizational security policies to those services. Important tool, I think just about every organization that leverages SaaS, which is, let's face it, everybody, and infrastructure as a service as well. Your sysadmins would log into the CASB to log into Amazon, for sure. That would be kind of one path, right? You log all their activity that way. It's just a great centralized way to govern that activity, and it also prohibits kind of going around that as well and trying to log into those services directly. So, but that's a unique thing. The rest of the three don't have anything to do with the end user, and in fact, CNAPP is an umbrella term for the first two plus a little bit more. So let's talk about CSPM and CWPP. They're kind of the cornerstones of the default set of tools you need for cloud security. Yep. CSPM is really about all of the security controls, the knobs, the dials of those services you use at your cloud provider, right? So when you, this is probably the example everyone knows best, when you spin up that storage bucket and you open it up to the world, a CSPM, through its myriad of tests it does, is going to find that and alert you and say, hey, you've got a publicly accessible storage bucket here, and then you've got to go and figure out what to do about it. But that's the role of the CSPM. It does not have any perspective on your data inside that S3 bucket, for example, or down in your workloads, the operating system in a VM, or even the configuration of a container. There's a little bit of an asterisk on that statement. Right. Basically, a CSPM can tell you about something if there's an API call available from the cloud provider. That's how a CSPM gets its information. It either follows CloudTrail log or it's asking questions of that cloud provider API.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then I guess then that begs me the obvious question: do I need all of these? As a CISO, I'm asking, looking at this, okay, I've got the 4 Cs in front of me. Do I need all of these?
It's a good question. If you're starting native and you're not bringing a tool set, I think you do, because the CSPM side, again, the big drawback, and it's not really a drawback, it's the way it's architected, is that it has no perspective inside a workload or in a storage bucket of your data. So there's always the potential that you have a mismatch between kind of the security control and the desired state and the data that's underneath it. And with a CSPM alone, you'll never know that.
Oh, maybe a better way to put this across. Maybe let's start from a scenario then. In that case, I'm starting cloud security today. I have, I guess, to your point earlier, I've got a credit card. I swiped it. I decided to go down the path of AWS, and I am starting my career in AWS security. Do I need a CSPM at that point if I'm starting day one today?
Probably not. You probably don't. I think my answer to that question has probably changed over time. I think people ask me that kind of in the early days of Dome 9 as we were kind of building that tool. And honestly, if we hit a customer or a prospect a little bit too early before they felt the pain of scale, and we sort of define that as, at that time, kind of in 2014, it was still very much kind of virtual machine and container based. It was a little bit less kind of service fabric consumption that we see now. So, we base that on that machine. And sorry, one sec here, window pop up. Sorry, where was I?
No, so the Dome 9 conversation, where basically in the initial conversation whether everyone needs a CSPM or not in the beginning.
Yeah. So the challenge, so I think once you hit that scale mark, and we defined it on that virtual machine basis, and in fact we sort of still do. There are very few cloud native applications that don't have, let's say, at least containers, if not, some EC2 kind of instances. There are some, absolutely, and we see more and more, but we built that on that, and we said it was about the point where they had sort of 50 workloads. 50 workloads, and let's define workload a little bit loosely on purpose, is where you started to feel the pain of, how do I govern this? Let's not forget every workload has a security group around it. You can share those, but sometimes you don't. And so you go from, again, if you are moving from that traditional world, you go from managing a pair or for redundancy in the low double digits of firewalls to literally, like with 50 workloads, maybe 100 firewalls, maybe 200 firewalls, right? And so these aren't all anticipated, and that's one of many examples, right? And so I think around that 50 workload area, you really start to feel the pain. Now, why the answer is different now is that I think we're doing a better job at getting to that consumer that hasn't yet made the leap, and they're fewer and fewer, right? That haven't dabbled at least in these infrastructure as a service platforms. But we're doing a better job of evangelizing, I think, right from the start, that just adopt it. Adopt it now so that you don't have to sort of retrofit it into your process. Because it seems really cool when you start credit swiping, but there is a little bit of governance that makes that process a little bit slower, right? Like, you do want to know, as you debut these resources, you want them to have some level of security hardening. You want great visibility over them all. If you're a multi-cloud consumer, as you grow from one platform to 2 to 3 to maybe more, you want to govern them all sort of similarly. So as you scale, the challenges really, really do, I mean, they're huge, but I think we're doing a better job of just even informing the consumer that's just getting there, that think about it from the outset and it'll save you time and heartache.
Oh, actually, that's interesting, because it goes back to what you were saying just before as well, where CSPM is a great way to look at tools that allow you to use a cloud API to find your security posture. But at the same time, if you are someone who is new in AWS or any other cloud for that matter, you don't really necessarily need to jump into it, to your point, unless you reach a certain workload where you're going, oh, this is getting to a point where probably I can't maintain this on my own anymore. Either I grow a team, or I do automation, or I use a CSPM to somehow figure out how wide my attack surface is as well.
Right. Yeah, and at some point it grows so big that you're not confident you even know what it is.
Yeah, or maybe this is what people talk about, the whole visibility thing as well, right? Where it kind of goes to, oh, I don't know how many workload accounts are, or I don't know how many workloads are running at any given point in time, because they keep going up and down. So just to even have that precise, so maybe what are some of the challenges people see in the earlier point? And I'm curious, because you did the Dome 9 period, and seems like you've seen a few generations of CSPM as well. What are some of the challenges that people can expect in the beginning of starting their cloud security posture management, but without a tool maybe, or maybe with a tool?
Yeah, I think without the tool, it's like I suggested before, a proliferation of controls, not just security groups, but inside of VPC, you need a very specific configuration depending on what you're doing. If you want traffic in or out, and you've got similar conventions to what you're used to, but they're all expressed differently. They're all editable by anyone who's got enough access. That's kind of the other side. It's not just about how much infrastructure there is, but there's how many people have their hands into this. How many people do you need? Are you thinking like this from the start, or out of convenience, are you taking your built-in administrator level profile and copying it for every user? Right? That's often how we start, because we don't really understand the implications. We don't understand that, well, geez, all I need is one malicious actor with a set of credentials, and they don't even need to know what my network looks like. Why would they? They log into my cloud console and they just, they know everything. And they can manipulate everything. Depending on how many services I use, and DNS is a terrible one for this, because it's sort of the authority for where users get routed based on kind of the name resolution that happens. I mean, if someone's got the keys to that, it's they can harvest passwords via kind of a different route and a malicious site. It's terrible. So there's a reason we're focusing on access. How many times have we heard IAM is the new perimeter? Right. Yeah. And as we talk about CNAPP, we'll talk about a category of tool that Gartner thinks that's true as well. And that's part of the reason they've kind of made this umbrella category, is to make sure we're thinking about IAM and entitlements and all that.
Wait, did we go into, so maybe it's a good time to explain CNAPP again. So it's
sure. No, we haven't. We were stuck on CSPM. This is the problem with the people that like to talk, right?
I'm like, I don't remember us talking about CNAPP. So good segue. What is CNAPP then?
Yeah, so CNAPP is really new. It's still evolving. It is it's an umbrella that encompasses CSPM, which I think we've done a good job of sort of high level talking about, and CWPP, which we haven't talked about enough yet. We'll get to in a minute, and a couple of other things, that are sort of on the roadmap. One is CIEM, the identity and entitlements part of this, right? The identity part, and because again, when you have one central login, boy, we've got to get that nailed. We really do. We can't be sloppy. Concepts like blast radius and just how much permission each login has. It's an effort to fine tune that, but it's an effort that pays off in spades, right? If we ever do, heaven forbid, have an issue like that. So yeah, so we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's in CNAPP. Let's talk about CWPP, because it kind of rounds out, that traditional, which is so silly because CSPM is less than 10 years old, but traditional in cloud lineage, at least, bucket. So CWPP is exactly the complement to what a CSPM can't do. And that is down at the workload level, inside of my VMs, my instances, and inside of my containers, I have content that a CSPM can't see. Now, I did say there's an little asterisk there. As we get to more and more container utilization, container orchestration, these public cloud platforms are doing a better job of being able to host these containers in registries. Amazon, for example, has a feature that you can scan for basic vulnerabilities inside a container that's inside of ECR. And so because Amazon can do it, you can make an API call to get those results. Some CSPMs now claim they also have CWPP coverage, but a consumer has to be careful, because they only do where the workload is supported in this way natively by their cloud provider, and they can get the details via API. So that's never true for EC2 instances or VMs or the equivalent on the other. There is no API call that tells me what's inside that.
That's right.
But there is for some containers, because we're getting smarter about this, at the platform level.
Wow. Actually, I've got a question here from Ubaid. Where and why you would choose CSPM, CNAPP over cloud native tools such as AWS GuardDuty?
Great question. And a real common question. I don't know if it's an either or kind of answer. GuardDuty is this really powerful but completely black box native tool from AWS that looks at your configuration, looks at activity via CloudTrail log, and looks at network activity as well, and can do some really cool things. The thing it doesn't do has have any perspective in your workload. So it can do a little bit of what a CSPM does, but we haven't even got really into the compliance side of a CSPM and the guardrails and remediation. And there's a lot of conversation to have kind of on the advanced CSPM side. But remember, a CSPM has no perspective into the workload, neither does guard duty. So there's a hole here. So, the CWPP is truly the one thing you can't do without, because at least at some small scale, you can probably get by with the native tools of the cloud provider on the CSPM side. I would say for a very limited time in your scale, but you can.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. Hopefully, Obey, that answered your question. Feel free to ask a follow-up as well, man. Good question as well. And that kind of takes me to the other point when CWPP is an interesting one as well, because if you were to take away, I guess there's so many C's now that are evolving, even with the identity access manager as well. If I take a step back and we started with a conversation about someone starting today in an AWS environment, one AWS account, simple infrastructure, you probably do not need a CSPM. You probably can use cloud native tools to understand a bit, like for example, you can switch on guard duty, and you can see what's happening from a network perspective or other things that guard duty can kind of share information on. But if you say create a lot of resources, even within that one AWS account, you kind of still reach a point where it does quickly go out of your hand. And I'm thinking about this, maybe if you follow best practice and instead of creating everything in one AWS account, you start creating multiple AWS accounts, which is where the scale comes in. What kind of challenges in the beginning can people expect who are looking at solving security posture? We spoke about visibility. I'm sure visibility gets even more complex as we kind of go through multiple AWS accounts. Is there anything else that kind of happens as you scale your AWS accounts, even though that's the best, quote unquote, best practice from all cloud service providers? Create more because they don't charge any more extra.
That's right. Create more. It limits that blast radius that we sort of talked about a little bit, right? No longer do I have simply one login. There are several, because there's one top level root login that always exists. But now there's several. It's not like one ring to rule them all exactly, which is great, and that's why we do that. But you're right. It's just more organizational challenge, right? I would say if that's your strategy, and I think for the enterprise that's your strategy necessarily. But to your point, even if you're smaller, it might be your strategy from a security and governance perspective. If that's your strategy, there are some native tools. If you're a consumer of AWS organizations, for example, their high-level tools observe that and sort of allow you to roll out policy across your organization, your master and your kind of child accounts, as I think of them, at least. I don't know if that's the right nomenclature. So, if you do think about a third-party tool set, it's really important to make sure that it ticks that box and it observes the same thing. And if you are an organization's customer, you want to make sure that this CSPM or CWPP or both are bolted to everything you do. Right? Don't allow a shadow account that isn't governed. Make sure that it's somehow bolted to your AWS organization so that when you spin up a new account, it's there. Without anything without having a ticket and someone having to do something manually. Just make sure that if you do go third party, that's something that that happens.
Also, scaling it with the new accounts being created. And because I think I guess I know we're going into the details of this, but I think my understanding even with starting a new AWS account, you can automate quite a bit in the provisioning of the account as well. So you can use that as an opportunity to include these conversations as well. We are able to add more things in there. Now, sounds like we definitely didn't touch on compliance a bit more, but what does compliance look like at this scale now? Because I imagine in one AWS account, it's not really like a lot of, it's still a data center for comparison's sake, but at a scale level, I imagine the compliance complexity increases as well then. So can you touch a bit on that as well?
Yeah, it does. And multi-cloud is where the complexity really, really jumps, right? Because you're trying to govern.
Yeah, I was going to get to that later after this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe let's start with the scaled AWS and then move on to the multi-cloud one, because that'd be interesting as well.
Sounds good. I think compliance is part. There's a compliance piece to every CSPM and there's a compliance piece to every CWPP on purpose, right? Because a lot of us are governed formally and we have to observe a data security standard. Others simply want to adhere to a standard to prove to their stakeholders that we're taking security seriously, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of people drive this stake between security and compliance. I don't so much, because I think they're intimately related. They're so related that I don't bother doing so. I think there's certainly very different personas about consuming compliance and security, but let's leave that for maybe another podcast. So yeah, the challenge as you scale, like you say, is simply another account. Often what will happen is like you say, we'll automate the creation of that account. We'll even automate the set of base resources via Terraform or CloudFormation in that child account. We'll push something standard so that there are a base set of tools we can use as we go forward. So there's a lot to measure as we scale out. I think the largest Dome 9 customers had in the high hundreds of accounts, because they adopted a cloud first strategy, and they used it across every business unit, across every project team. They had central kind of GRC with risk management. It was a very significant leap for them, and so they it was absolutely a cloud first process, and that was with one provider.
Wow.
By now I can imagine their scale, right? And
Yeah.
maybe I'll have the luxury of having them as a customer again, but so imagine just the need to govern all of that consistently. You do need one tool set at that point. I'm a firm believer that even having a master parent account that has visibility via IAM relationships to the rest of these things, just again, if the promise of the cloud is true,
Yeah.
if we didn't come to build our security tools ourselves, then I think a third-party tool that's purpose built for that. We hear that a lot. We hear where we're successful at Orca, we hear that our customers were challenged in sort of scotch taping services together to get the visibility they wanted. They could for a certain amount of time, but they felt like at some point it was out of their control, and they really liked how easy Orca was. And I think that purpose built that way for sure.
That's interesting, because I always go back to, like, I mean, obviously, I'm a massive believer of open source as well, and a lot of times, every time I do say that, I always add the caveat that also means that whoever has written the code for you in the organization is probably, I mean, I guess you kind of need to hold on to them for a long time and make sure they're really happy, because once they move on and then you're left with this framework behind, you're not really sure what's covered, what's not covered, how much documentation is there or not there. I think at that point, because I mean, I guess so in my I guess my day job as well, we use CSPMs, and because it does make sense after a certain scale that it just goes so out of control. And to your point about, it's like basically it's not even credit card swiping, because even if you use the AWS organization, you've logically connected all of them together. But if an organization is large enough, there's already people still coming up with new accounts, coming up with new compute instances. AWS keeps coming up with new compute instances, or I mean, all the cloud providers do. And then you have this compliance piece right in the middle of all of that you need to separate out from everything else, or maybe sometimes include the entire environment in a compliance standard. That to me, and so from a multi-cloud perspective, I'm curious. I mean, we get that challenge, and that's why we went down the CSPM path. But apart from compliance, I imagine there are other things as well in a multi-cloud space where I have AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, and I'm trying to go security across that. So what kind of challenge am I looking at that point? That at your point where it goes out of control.
Yeah, and this is where I think the line between compliance and security doesn't service that well, because really what you're trying to do is govern the same. So that means infrastructure, that means rights and permissions, that means hopefully if you're more than one cloud provider, you're connected to all three with some kind of SSO, because managing three sets of identities and different project teams using different platforms, it can get, that alone can, I think, get really complex. So at that point, I think you're sort of necessarily looking at the side of SSO, which again, if you're looking for a security tool, make sure it supports that, like you'd expect a security tool to, for sure. So you can simplify that, but yeah, it just becomes an absolute nightmare trying to govern. And unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that customers wind up kind of least common denominating the technology, so that they won't use something in one platform that doesn't have an equivalent function in another. simply for, maybe they wrote their DRP plan that they use. If Amazon dies, I mean, it's silly in some ways, but if Amazon dies, they're going to DRP over to another provider or back to a data center or something, right? I mean, it's massively complex. I mean, like you say, I think we often misjudge how complex it can be with one provider. When you get to more than one, I mean, it's CASB is part of it in terms of the user access. That's really complicated too. But just governing what people can do and how much rights and privilege you have, and blast radius around every kind of account that logs in. Not even if you have SSO, every kind of role that gets assigned, that gets really, really important.
Actually, as we were talking about this, I kind of keep thinking I can see the value of a CNAPP as well, because I'm looking at this going, I've got a CSPM, I've got a CWPP, and I've got, I mean, I don't have a CASB, but I'm pretty sure if we had to go down that path, as a security team, we're looking at managing all these different tools, which would provide a very different perspective of the same environment. And it also, out of curiosity, who looks after all these? So is there like in your mind, is there like an individual who's looking after CSPM, another individual CWPP, another individual, like I mean, have you seen like certain patterns for who manages this in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different who manages it, who consumes the alerts generated by them. They're probably slightly different, right? I think the alerts still go to your security operations center to be acted upon. That's no different, right, from a CSPM or a CWPP. Look, a CWPP isn't new. It's the only part of this that isn't new. From the data center days, you had something running on the host that was looking for software vulnerabilities and malware. I mean, some of us didn't. Some of us trusted that perimeter a little bit too much, but at the enterprise level, we did, right? And in fact, there happened a lot of cloud washing because vendors took that approach, said we're ready, we're cloud certified, install our agent, and it still sort of identifies itself by IP address, which we have far less control over in the public cloud, and there are problems there. But so we brought that along with the CSPM is net new in the cloud. There was no equivalent, but we brought that workload protection with us, right? And so you're right. CNAPP is the nice umbrella that kind of encapsulates this all, but it does say one thing very specifically, is that the workload side and the cloud security posture management side, they have to share data. That's the key thing. Gartner predicted many years ago that CWPP and CSPM would come together. I think they saw the writing on the wall, as many of us did, as they kind of unfolded. Like, you're right. You need both to get a holistic view of your visibility into where the risks lie. You absolutely need both when you get to above very beginner scale, right? How you get both can vary a little bit, but you need the functionality of both. And so what CNAPP says is, look, if I find malware in a workload, what's the very next question I'm going to have about that? Is it exposed? Is it exploitable? Right? And that's a question I can't answer with just a CWPP perspective. I need to know what the cloud security controls are around it. Security group config, internet gateway, VPC, right? I need to know all that. Then I can be confident, okay, there's malware, it's contained. I can take my time getting to it because I've got a million other high priority alerts still in my SOC, right? But so, what Gartner says, why CNAPP is so important, it can be confusing. I mean, you've got these two categories. It's not like we have 10. Do we really need an umbrella for two? The umbrella specifically says these things have to trade information, and that's a challenge, right? We've seen CSPM vendors buy or create CWPP technology, because I think this story has been unfolding for a long time. You absolutely need both. What we haven't seen is when they kind of acquire that functionality, kind of going that extra mile and wrapping it into one cohesive platform. Because that's how we risk things, at least from an Orca standpoint. Our perspective is how we risk observations in the workload is inseparable to the things around it. Right? It's inseparable to a lot of things. It's inseparable to information about the vulnerability we found. Is there a fix? That's context too. It's not just network context. Is there a fix? Is there some loose network security control around me that could provide maybe lateral movement? That's context too. So that's important. As we think about risk, I mean, we hear about this notion of alert fatigue so often. And I think it's because we use a tool for this, a tool for that, and they all have their own perspective. They all have their own idea of what high priority or high severity means. But no matter how we get there, at the end of the day, when we look at those studies of SOC operators sitting there and responding to alerts, I mean, they have no ability even to get to the medium severity. They can't get through the high.
Yeah, and wait, so because the SOC team also reminded me then, because this is also fed into a SIEM.
Yep,
right?
that's right.
At certain point, whoever ends up having I guess at some point, I'm sure everyone wishes they have a SIEM, because it's not just the 4 Cs of the world, but there's all these other tools that you have in your organization as well, especially if you're hybrid or multi-cloud or whatever. Then, so alert fatigue is a thing in this space as well. But from that, how does the CSPM space, or just this cloud security posture space, is dealing with not having people have a lot of alert fatigue? Like, what's the remedy? Like, more context, or where does that go?
Yeah, CSPMs are famous for risking things high severity that aren't. Let's put it that way. I'll give you a good example. Maybe day one, you provision your AWS account, you spin up some infrastructure in a region that's closest to you because you want great performance, and you log off, and you do that a couple times. You kind of expand this region. You build a great little small, to your point, data center.
Yeah.
You get to the point where you're a little bit challenged with visibility. You throw a CSPM at, and the first thing it's going to tell you is that you've got all these high priority alerts for default security groups in every region you don't use, because they're there by default.
Yep.
That to, I won't say every CSPM, but to the majority of them, is a high severity alert. Now, it should be an alert. I'm not suggesting this is information that we shouldn't have anywhere, right? Because someone can go and manipulate that default security group, assign it to something, and there can be either a misconfiguration or something worse if there's some ill intent. So it's not that it's not important, but should that be a high severity in relation to everything I do, right? That's the challenge is, and it's because no perspective on data, no idea if the control violation, how severe it truly is. Right, and CSPMs are getting a little better. You can customize some of the measurements. You can take into account tagging standards you have, and in that way you can get a little bit more accurate on the tests you run, for sure. But there's still this disconnect, for sure.
Interesting. So, and to maybe take this a step further, how has CSPM evolved? Because I mean, you've worked in the space since Dome 9, which for people who have been in the cloud space since the beginning was probably the pioneer in the whole cloud security posture management space. There, a lot of other companies came out of it, like people who were working in those companies started their own cloud security products after that. I think Redlock was, I believe, one of them, or maybe not Redlock, but another one. But I think Dome 9, and there's another company, and then it just goes into, just spreads out, and this whole platter of cloud security posture managers came out after that.
That's right.
What's the evolution that what kind of conversations were you having with Dome 9 days and with CSPM, and what CSPM looked like then, and what has it moved on to till today? Like, what are the kind of conversations you're having now? I'm curious.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it dovetails real nice into our discussion of CNAPP. The hardest questions to answer when I worked at Dome 9 were those around content and what's in my VMs. It wasn't that you couldn't measure anything. So a CSPM, again, can measure most things that a API call to a cloud provider, where one is possible, right? So I can measure how many instances I've got running. I can measure how much permission those instances have. There is some value there, right? But what we couldn't do is then match that to what's in there. We couldn't say, geez, your security group isn't configured right because I see you've got a web server running in your workload. There was no perspective. Or you've got a web server running that's trying to hear on port 80, but your security group doesn't have it open. Are you sure this is what you want? That was the kind of thing the more advanced customer, I mean, the beginner that got to Dome 9 was just so thankful for the visibility. Like, it was great, especially the multi-cloud beginner. We just saw smiles everywhere. Honestly, it was probably the easiest thing I've ever sold outside of where I am now, right? And so that was great. But the advanced customer started to feel the limitations, right? They did have a workload visibility, but it was from an old tool. They knew it well, so they were comfortable with it, but it didn't jive with the cloud security side. They had to manage these two separate things, and that was getting frustrating, for sure. So, I mean, when I heard about what Orca was doing, I mean, I jumped, literally jumped to it because it answered that question, right? Here we had this real super cloud native way to do almost the very same magic on the CSPM side, but combine it with the workload side. Answer that question. Yeah.
Wow. And actually, maybe is there like a because I think we had Srinath from Netflix last week, and he was talking about Orca as well. And you guys use site scanning. So I mean, I know we're not trying to sell anything. So I'm just kind of curious. It's like a short elevator pitch for how is Orca CSPM different to the previous generations, I guess.
Yeah, it is that workload side. So at Dome 9, we could say we were agentless because we were. There was absolutely no agent to install. We got all this great visibility across the services you use, but nobody could say, I can get workload visibility without installing an agent, right? Until Orca, that wasn't possible. And so really what we've done is said, let's use some cloud native methods to do workload discovery. And you're right, we call that process side scanning. And what it does is it mounts the volumes of your disk and it recreates it just like your workload is. It reads all the logs. You know, it does even things like file integrity monitoring that traditionally have needed an agent running down there. There's about 7 data security standards that require that kind of visibility into changes at the file system. It even does that all from the side, right? So on first scan, a complete inventory of what's on your machine. We know the software, the versions, therefore the vulnerabilities. We know what's around it because Orca is also a CSPM built from the ground up. So we know the security controls around it too. And that's the real difference, is it's both, and both sides share information, right? We build this data model and then we interrogate it. We ask it questions. Is, okay, I found a vulnerability. What's the deal? Is it open? Is it not? How old is it? Is it being talked about in the media? Is there a fix? So, but we do all that again from the side without an agent, and that's kind of the agentless and the context or the foundations that Orca is built on for sure.
Awesome. And I think I just got an answer from Ubaid as well. I think Aquasec's probably the one company that came up from Dome 9, I believe. Then.
It may have been a spinoff. We've got others too. We've got a really interesting kind of shift left approach, right? Judging kind of intent in the way of CloudFormation or Terraform, kind of measuring that from a security perspective, which is really interesting. I think most of these tools are shifting there. I think some of these tools are shifting in the other direction too. I've had an incident now. Help me understand from a networking perspective, help me understand from a workload perspective what went on, almost like a forensic perspective, right? There's kind of both sides happening, which is really interesting.
Yeah, sounds like I probably in a few months' time I'll be doing another one of these with another few more C's at the end of this, like for something for incident, something for shifting left. But this is really awesome. And I'm going to switch gears because I think we've been talking about technology for some time. I'm going to go into some fun questions.
Sure.
I just wanted to make sure I've answered all the questions that came up here. Yes, I did. Perfect. So this is in fun section. I normally ask like 3 questions, not personal at all. Just get to know you. And plus you're Canadian, so I'm pretty sure you're super nice about them anyways. So the first question that I have is, what do you spend most time on when you're not working on cloud?
I am a hardcore nerd. For sure. I think that's what's kept me going for 27 years. So, I'd like to say that I have this elaborate list of hobbies, but I'm in this studio, right, of green screens and black screens to my right and cameras and lights. And so I do a lot of this. I have a hobby in kind of digital animation too. And those dovetail kind of really nicely. I do get outside. I live here at the base of the Rocky Mountains in Western Canada. So in 45 minutes, I've got like world-class hiking and skiing, and I definitely take advantage of that too. So yeah, probably that my second most fun thing to do other than nerd out is to be outside for sure.
Awesome. And that's a great way to spend some winter. I mean, it's winter here in Australia, so I would hopefully get some snow as well. What is something that you're proud of but is not on your social media?
Oh, that's a good one, boy.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of people talk about families. A lot of people talk about, I guess, I mean, from your perspective, I guess, the whole evolution that you've seen as well. But it's a tough one to answer quickly, though. It does put people on the spot.
It is too. Yeah, I'd go closer to sort of the family side, and for me, it's getting a work-life balance has been a little bit challenging this year. for sure. I don't think I'm unique in that way, but I joined Orca just over a year ago, and we're moving so fast that I'm one of the most senior people there, which is hard to believe, right? Just kind of how fast we're moving, and so to get there, especially in a COVID time, we talked a little bit about travel and stuff. I haven't really been able to see anybody. We've built this, large, valued in the billions dollar company without meeting each other, right? And that's taken a lot of effort. My health has kind of suffered for it, for sure. So I'm really thankful for feeling better, for my family being there to help. It's hard. I hurt my back really bad and been through a bunch of therapy, and it's doing much better. But it's hard. You fancy yourself an independent person, and all of a sudden, boy, you realize you're sure glad you have some people around you that love you. So I think that's a lesson for this year is that.
Awesome. And I'm glad. I think everyone's grateful to have people support them. Even if it's not injury in general, I feel so. Thank you for sharing that. So last question, what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share?
Oh boy. Yeah, the cuisine's not hard. It's definitely sort of Mexican food, as traditional as we can find. Taco? Yeah. I met some people through my tenure of startups, and super sort of international companies and lots of different cultures. So more than kind of the Western version of food that you can get here, the authentic versions, right? And I think my favorite is definitely sort of Mexican. My family traveled to Mexico and stayed in a very kind of remote village, and brought hockey sticks with us and taught them hockey, and they taught us a bunch of kind of local traditions and foods, and that's probably why is more like that, is the memory.
Wait, so tacos or nachos, or is it, or what like which?
No,
burritos?
Lots more. I'm not even going to attempt the names because I'll absolutely butcher them, but those for sure. But carnitas
and everything else,
all
that
sorts
they
of good stuff. Everything. The spicier the better.
Awesome, love it. But Patrick, this was really interesting, man. And thank you so much for taking the time out. Where can people find you for follow-up questions on this whole CSPM space? Where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, reach me on social media. I'm Cloud Chronicle on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. Reach me at Orca for sure. I'm at patrick@orca.security. Nice and simple. Happy to answer your questions, and just kind of do one of these, see if there's a fit, and explore.
Awesome. Thanks so much for doing this. And I think I definitely found that I need to bring you back again, probably when we have the few more C's to add, which I can't put in the screen. I won't be able to fit into the screen anymore. I believe they're just like, I would start making a big umbrella.
That's right. Well, you got a scroller. We'll just fill it with all the C's, right? Hey, I'd love to.
All the C's in there with some space in between. It just keeps increasing. It only makes me think that as this continues and as each cloud provider kind of just keeps growing, I wonder if it just would be like one cloud, like, because be like too complex, just one cloud. So I can only wish.
Some meta kind of broker that, just one that's already attempted, right? Because it's so complex, for sure. Yeah, you're right.
It is. And I think it'll be really interesting if someone can really simplify that, like abstract it to a point where you don't care if you're in AWS, GCP, or whatever. I think to your point earlier, Kubernetes kind of tried doing it, but that went in another direction. So that's one other topic. But I hope everyone got to enjoy listening to all these different tools as well. Next week we have, I guess, another community contributor security conference. Actually, security conference remind me. Forward CloudSec is closing their call for paper. I'm gonna put the website in the show notes as well. They're gonna we're supporting them. We're supporting sponsor for. Or supporting partner. I don't know what the right word is. I'm still need to clarify that. But it's called Forward CloudSec. It's a cloud security conference run by volunteers. And it usually happens around AWS Reinforce. So if anyone is keen to kind of jump into that, definitely put a paper through. And you definitely be hanging out with the elite forces of cloud security. But that's all for today. And I will see you next week with another episode on AWS security. But until then, I've got my music queued in, if it comes in. Yes, it did. All right, everyone. Thank you. See you next week. See ya.